Hey, and welcome to another exciting episode of Pop Goes the Culture. I'm David Levin, and today we are talking to Sam Viviano, former art director of Mad Magazine and one of the great cartoonists of our time, in my opinion. Not that that matters. Sam, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you. I would love to chat with you about your career at Mad Magazine now that you've sort of put a button on it, because you're sort of in addition to having formerly worked for Mad Magazine, you are now in a situation in which um, I would say you are sort of adding to the history of Mad Magazine in terms of letting people know about it, and you're working on multiple projects in regard to the history of Mad Magazine. But first, let's talk a little bit about you and your pathway to Mad and how you got there and what you were doing.
I'm going back a long, long way. Uh, I, I, I think, like a lot of people who ended up doing what I do and have done, I started very young. I was drawing at 3 years old. Of course, everybody draws when they're 3 years old. The difference is that when the other kids moved on to things like sports and girls and what have you, I kept drawing. And I realized that at some point that's what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I went to the University of Michigan and graduated from the art school, which really did not particularly help me in my goals because it did not have courses in illustration, cartooning, whatever. I did a lot of work in college on the side that kind of prepped me for it. But I knew that if I was going to have a career, I needed to move from Michigan to New York. And that's what I did right after graduation. I came to New York. Fortunately, I had an Aunt Babe and Uncle Vince in Brooklyn who allowed me to stay with them while I kind of set myself up. Uh, Realized very quickly I needed some kind of job, even if it wasn't going to be art, because I figured out more or less right away that I wasn't going to become a rich and famous illustrator anytime soon. So I got a job as a textile designer, and
Really?
I did that for a year, and it was actually good in a number of ways. Not only that I learned certain materials that I still use to this day, and I made friends that I still have to this day, but also somebody who came to work as a temp there had worked as a temp at Marvel Comics. And he introduced me to Marie Severin, who was a long term uh, uh, influence at Marvel, as she had been at EC Comics before that. And she connected me with Paul Lakin, who at that time was editing Marvel's Mad Like magazine, Crazy. And I managed to do some work for Crazy for about a year and a half, I guess, 2 years. Meantime, I started getting other jobs. And after a year at the textile job, I said, okay, I can't burn the candle at both ends. I can't
Hmm.
work all day designing textiles and then spend all night drawing cartoons. So, knowing I did not want to be a textile designer the rest of my life, I quit the job and began freelancing full time. Uh, my Probably the most important change right off was I got work from Scholastic magazines.
Ah,
Dynamite, Bananas, but also Scholastic Action, Scholastic, Junior Scholastic, Senior Scholastic. And pretty much any magazine that Scholastic was publishing and distributing through classrooms, I did some work for at that time. We're talking right now about the late 70s, 78, 79. When I started bringing my portfolio around in 1976, and I'd bring it to like ad agencies and meet with creative directors who would look at what I was doing. Uh, I kept getting, you should go to MAD. You should go to MAD. I guess what they saw in my portfolio led them to feel I should go to MAD. So I called up John Putnam, the art director at MAD, and he told me right off that MAD was a closed shop. He says, we have all the artists we need, but if you want
Wow.
to pay us a social visit, by all means, come by. So I did. I brought my portfolio in, and John Putnam looked at it, and Lenny Brenner, his production guy, looked at it. Nick Meglin, one of the editors there, and they were very polite. They were very nice. They said nice things about what I had, but they reiterated that they had no need for me.
Was so now, did they give you any feedback, or was it just basically, yeah, this is never going to happen because all our artists are going to live forever?
Well, no, it wasn't. This will never happen. It's just it's not going to happen right now. And I think that actually was a very useful thing for them to say,
Hmm.
because it didn't put me in a position of saying, "Oh, I gotta work for Mad." More to the point, I said, "I gotta start working." Now, as I said, this was '76, and I was still. I had actually not even started the job as a textile designer at that point, and so what I was looking to do was to figure out who I was
Hmm.
visually as an artist, as an illustrator, as a cartoonist. And that year uh, actually helped me do that. Um, but it was also knowing that what I was doing was really the kind of thing they had in MAD. And I thought, well, maybe someday. But I didn't push it. I'm used to stop by from time to time, more
Right.
social calls, but I didn't expect work from them. And I was happy with what I was getting from Scholastic. And even there were some other things brewing as well. But then, out of the blue, this was right around Thanksgiving of 1980, I got a call from Al Feldstein, the editor of Mad. And he said, do you want to do a cover? Now, I was 27 years old. I was just at the beginning of my career. I was not really prepared to be doing a cover for Mad at that point, but I certainly wasn't going to turn him down.
Knowing what you know now, what inspired him to call you at that time, and of all things, to have you do a cup that, oh, we're going to get you started on a, you're going to do a marginal, you're going to do something small, a spot illustration. They gave you the cover.
Well, all I can say is this: you mentioned a little earlier that uh, the dream scenario that they might have presented to me was, we'll never need you because our artists are going to live forever.
Hmm.
In fact, it was a running joke in the circles of those young artists who wanted to work for Mad that the only way you could get into Mad was if somebody died. Well, in 1980, Norman Mingo, the man who had been doing covers for the last 25 years for Mad, died.
Oh.
Um, and maybe also that same year, uh, John Putnam, the art director, passed away on a Mad trip. So I think that Feldstein was starting to feel that maybe he needed to open things up a little.
Got it.
And the fact was that Meglin knew my work. I had visited, I'd crossed paths with him several times over the
Hmm.
years that had passed. And John Ficara, who had just joined the MAD staff in October of 1980, had known my work from Scholastic because he had been writing things for Scholastic. So I don't know for sure. This is my hypothesis, but I believe that when Feldstein said we have to find some new artists, both Meglin and Ficarra kind of pitched me. And why he started me off with a cover, I don't know. You'll have to ask Feldstein, and I don't think that he's answering his phone calls anymore.
I am friends with a couple of mediums, but we'll leave that for another day.
Yeah. So all I know is I got offered a cover. It was not a complicated cover.
Hmm.
It was just the head of Larry Hagman as J.R. Ewing from the
Hmm.
TV show Dallas, which was very popular at the time. And in fact, a legendary story arc had just developed, which was JR got shot, and the
Hmm.
big question was who shot JR.
Right.
So wanted JR very big on the cover with a gun, uh, pointing at him, and out the other ear was a flag that said "Blech" with the L. So a simple
So,
cover.
so they say they commissioned it to you with a sketch or something, or did you come up
Yes.
with that? How did that go?
Yeah, Feldstein gave me a little drawing on a yellow post-it note. Well, I guess it wasn't a post-it note. It was just a little piece of yellow paper, and I have no idea if I still have that somewhere or not.
Boy, that would go on eBay.
Yeah, probably. So and that was not uncommon. That's Feldstein would do a lot of doodles. You may know that he started out as an artist in comic books before he
Yes.
started editing the horror and science fiction titles at EC Comics.
Hmm.
And so I was very nervous. I went home. I knew that Mad artwork was done twice up, so I did this twice up, and that meant that it was a very big head with a very big 10-gallon hat. And the more I worked on it, the more uncomfortable I became because it just felt like I was just painting acres and acres of hat. And so when I finished it, I said, I got to try again. I put it aside and I did a second version, I think 1.5 times up. And
Hmm.
that was the one that was used on the cover. Now, the biggest difference was that the second one being only at 1.5 times up, I'm drawing a very small Alfred on that banner, on that flag. And it wasn't very good. I didn't think so then. I don't think so now. Uh, what I didn't know, and it showed my naivete and my innocence in the ways things were or could be done. It never occurred to me that I could have done another Alfred separately at whatever size I wanted, and they could strip it in.
Hmm.
Well, you have to do all of the art in one piece. So that printed. However, I never heard from Feldstein again. Um, I don't know exactly why. There are a number of conjectures or guesses. It could have been as simple as the fact that the issue didn't sell well and Feldstein blamed me. It could have been that Feldstein was just realized how uncomfortable he was working with a youngster he hadn't worked with before.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know. All I know is I never got another job from Feldstein, and the next mad job I got came 4 years later after Feldstein retired and Nick Meglin and John Ficarra took over as editors. And I guess they called me up out of the blue and said, "Hey, how'd you like to do a movie parody?" And that was the parody of the movie Ghostbusters.
Did you approach the Mad stuff differently than the stuff? Because you had done parodies over at Scholastic, I know, which is a different game. Did you approach it differently? Did you approach it, what was different or what was the same about what you did for the Mad?
Well, when I was doing stuff for Scholastic, specifically Bananas magazine. Now, Bananas was as was Dynamite. These two magazines were outliers at Scholastic
Hmm.
because they weren't educational. They weren't academic magazines. They were meant to be entertaining. And they had, teen celebrity interviews and goofy articles,
Right.
and particularly with Bananas, movie and TV parodies. Now, Bananas was edited by a guy who went by the name Jovial Bob Stein, a guy, yeah, yeah, a young man from Columbus, Ohio, whose dream was to grow up and edit a humor magazine. And I think he realized, in the same way that I did, that uh, Mad's positions were already taken. So he convinced somebody at Scholastic to let him publish Bananas. And Bananas was a very funny magazine.
Hmm.
It had a lot of terrific artwork. Um, and when I got these movie pairs, I should mention, by the way, that some years later, a few years later, after I think sales started to dip, Scholastic decided to cancel Bananas, and jovial Bob Stein, being out of a job, had to move in another direction.
He
So
pivoted.
yes, he started writing horror stories for kids, and realized that you don't want to write horror stories with the name Jovial Bob Stein.
No, not so
So,
much.
yeah, so he decided to go with his initials. And you may have heard of R.L. Stein of Goosebumps and Fear Street fame. That's my one. I knew him one story when he was working out of a cubicle at Scholastic Magazines, editing a goofy humor magazine.
He seems to have done pretty well for himself. I think he got
Yeah,
himself quite the franchise.
yes, he does, and he's managed to build that franchise for, geez, 30 years now, maybe more.
That's
Uh,
amazing.
yeah, definitely. But Bob Stein would give me these little parodies that he had written out with stick figures on bond paper. And I think the first thought I had was that I didn't want it to look anything like Mad. So I did those parodies more specifically in a comic book style, with comic book balloons and hand lettering and
Hmm.
borders on the panels. Um, and I did everything myself, soup to nuts, other than the writing. I hand lettered the balloons, and I think the only thing I left to Bob Feldgus, the art director, was to put the title in on the first page with a little
Hmm.
introduction. Those were set in type. So when you ask how Mad was different, well, it was different in a lot of ways because, first of all, they gave me a typewritten script that, in this case, I think had been written by Arnie Kogan, if I recall correctly.
Hmm.
And secondly, they gave me boards. The way things were done at MAD would be that once the article was edited, and that would usually end up uh, being copy edited by Al Feldstein himself, because he was counting characters to have it set in type. They'd send it to a type house. They get galleys back, and then they would make a mechanical. Lenny Brenner would make a mechanical with the type set in, showing where all the panels were, all the balloons, and Mad in those days and to this day, the balloons are typeset and they are hard edged. Uh, so once he had set up the mechanicals, Lenny would then set up on Bristol board twice up where the artwork should be and where the balloons were. And many artists, like Mort Drucker and Angelo Torres, would actually do their sketches right on the final boards. I always felt more comfortable first doing thumbnails
Hmm.
and then maybe drawing my sketches at print size. That way I could see the composition better, etc. So I could use the mechanical they gave me to do that. Um, the other thing that was different with Mad than with Scholastic was it was black and white. So I had to be very conscious of working with gray tones as
Mhm.
opposed to color. And then finally, I had to outline the word balloons.
Mhm.
So I think that, I guess, yeah, I guess I was already using rapidographs at that time because I learned how to use them when I was a textile designer. So I would use T square and triangle, and I would ink in the balloons. But then, and I don't know if this is true. I have to ask Angela Torres because I'm pretty sure that Mort Drucker didn't have to paste in his own type. I don't know about Angela. But I had to cut the type out of the stats that were given to me because they
Uh-huh.
take the galleys and stat them up twice up and rubber cement them into the word balloons.
Wow.
Yeah, and
And
because
they had been do that had been what they had been doing. They had been doing that since the EC days, as I recall.
well, the EC days, the lettering was done with something called a oh, I can't remember, but it was actually lettered mechanically right onto the
Right.
board. Yes,
Right.
but it wasn't typeset. It
No.
was,
Oh, got it. Right.
yeah.
But I mean, they would put they would put the balloons and all the type, and then the artist would write around that, as opposed to what later became, which is that the artist would draw it and leave space for balloons to be placed later.
Yeah, I think you are right about that. I think that that was the EC approach. Um, Now, the reason that the type is on the artwork is that you only have to shoot the artwork once. Now, that was
Uh,
true in the comic books because the color was added later. Now, with MAD, if you're doing artwork that is what we called in the old days continuous tone, meaning that you had grays and not just black and white, but you had gray
mhm.
areas. They would actually have to photograph that artwork twice. Once through a screen so that the grays were transformed into dot patterns.
Right.
And that way it could be printed because printing does not print actual grays. They print little dots of black ink, and the tinier the dots are and the farther spaced they are, the lighter the gray. And if the dots are bigger and closer together, the darker the gray.
Yes.
But then they would also have to shoot the artwork a second time as a line shot, meaning just for black and white. And that was for the type. And then the printer would take these two images and cut them together as a negative. I mean, it's a big, laborious process in those days, and the people who did it, particularly the people putting the negatives together at the
Right.
printer, people like Lenny Brenner, who was doing the production, it was a highly honed skill
Yeah.
that is now, almost entirely lost.
Yeah.
So that's the technical way that MAD was different. Um, I discovered pretty quickly that there was a more, I don't know, uh, in not concrete, not insubstantial. It was very substantial, intangible way that working for MAD was different than working for anybody else. Mostly, and by the time I was working for Matt on any kind of regular basis, in the mid '80s, I was already doing a lot of editorial work for other magazines. I was doing advertising work, and I was a professional illustrator, freelance.
Mhm.
And what that meant was I would get a call from an art director. I'd go and pick up the job. I'd come home, I do the sketches, deliver the sketches. They approve them or give me notes. I come back to my studio and do the finishes and deliver the final art. Now, on a step by step basis, MAD was exactly the same way. But
Mhm.
what made it different, and I think this is mostly due to Nick Meglin, but I think it actually came down from from Bill Gaines, the publisher, as well, which is that suddenly you found yourself not just delivering the job, but having to discuss your personal life and uh, tell me about your girlfriend. Tell me what do you
Yeah.
do? What do you eat for dinner? As I said, Nick particularly was always very curious and very interested in everything, uh, not just, oh, this is a nice job, thank you. And I think that that was part of what made Mad different than everyone else. That in retrospect, I look back at, and I'm not the only one. I'll talk with other members of what we call the usual gang of idiots, and the whole point was a kind of family, and if you were going to be part of the family, you had to deal with sharing personal aspects of your life as well as professional.
They were very welcoming to me, and I wasn't even like a major player. I was just, I was like, they treated me as family, not just friend of the family.
Yeah,
And and I did a couple of small jobs for Mad Magazine, and was very proud in my sort of small way to be a footnote within the usual gang of idiots. And no matter what was going on, uh, when I stopped by the Mad offices, again, like you said, it was Nick or whoever saying, "What's going on in your life? Come sit down. We're having a meeting. We're trying to be funny." you
yeah,
know, and they'd
yeah.
be brainstorming, and they're like, "Hey, come and sit down and brainstorm with us."
I was lucky enough to be part of this when Bill Gaines was still around.
Yeah.
Gaines died in '92, so I had maybe 8 years or so, 8 or 9 years, where I was part of that group, and I was not a regular right off the bat. I had to kind of prove myself, and but I mentioned before that it did follow through from Gaines at the top. It was very clear to me pretty early on that everybody really did things to make Bill laugh. He had his office at the end of the hall, and it was not forbidden. You can go in there whenever you wanted. But as a new guy, I didn't necessarily take advantage of that. But I really had my first sense of how that worked. I really am not quite sure uh, when this article was done, but I got an article um, called "Mad Goes to a Comedy Club,"
Hmm.
and there was a joke in there about who's that guy over at the bar scribbling down everything the comedian is saying. Oh,
Hmm.
that's Mad's Dave Berg. He's copying the gags so that he can use them in his next lighter side of. So I had to draw Dave Berg. And what that meant was that I needed to go and get reference for him. Now I'm gonna do a total tangent here and go back to talking about what made Mad like a family and how it stemmed from Bill Gaines. Many people know that Gaines took the Mad artists and writers on trips every year or two. This started in 1960 with a trip to Haiti, purportedly to convince the one subscriber in Haiti to renew his subscription. And
Right.
so Bill hired a bunch of Jeeps, took everybody to this guy's house. They camped out on his lawn. Bill knocked on the door. The guy opened the door and Bill said, "Why didn't you renew?" And of course, the guy was so taken by all this, he renewed on the spot. But what also happened apparently was that the next door neighbor was looking through his window as this was going on, and he thought it was so funny that he decided that he should subscribe to Matt as well.
Oh,
And
so you
Bill
doubled the
said the trip was
subscriptions.
a huge success. we doubled our circulation in Haiti. So this is a legendary story, and I'm sure it's at least partially true. But it became to me clear at some point in my life, and I don't know if it was during the trips or many years later, that the reason Bill took everybody on these trips was to create a feeling of camaraderie. Uh, People, readers, had this sense that all the artists and writers sat together in one big room shooting spitballs at each other,
Yeah.
as opposed to the fact that they were all professional freelancers working out of their studios, working out of their offices, working out of their homes, and in many cases barely ever saw each other. They didn't all live in New York. There's some living in Florida and California and other places. So by getting everyone together for a trip, it was like summer camp for Mad contributors. They go somewhere for 2 weeks or something like that, and Bill Gaines loved to eat, and he loved to travel, and he loved to do it with people. So this worked perfectly. That he would go somewhere, he'd have a lot of company, they'd have a lot of fun together, and it really did cohere as a family with
Yeah.
Bill Gaines as the big daddy. I was just saying, like every family, there were levels of dysfunction. There were people who didn't necessarily like each other. There were people who envied each other. There were occasional spats, but overall, it worked marvelously, and it really did create a family that years after Bill's death still worked. There was a reason why all of these guys continued to work for Mad years after Bill died, and it wasn't just for a paycheck. It was because Bill had instilled in them a loyalty, not just to him personally, but to Mad itself, as
Right.
something that was valuable and important to them. And for those of us who came after, the people who had been there before instilled that. And that even years later, long after Bill died, and I was on staff, we couldn't take him on trips anymore, but we could still do everything possible to say, yeah, you're important to us, you're valuable to us, your family. So going back to this job I had, which probably was around 88, 89, I'm going to guess. I needed to draw Dave Berg stealing gags at a comedy club. So I went and got the photos I had taken on my first Mad trip, which was in 1987. It was a trip to Switzerland first, Zermatt, and then to Paris. And being a newbie, of course, I was taking photographs left and right. So I had tons of photos of Dave Berg. But I also had tons of photos of everybody else on the trip. So I'm drawing this piece. It was a 2-page spread. I'm drawing Dave Berg there at the bar scribbling, but I drew Charlie Cadu, Mad Editor, as the guy doing the stand up on the stage,
I
and
remember that.
I drew Nick Meglin and John Ficarra and Jack Davis and Al Jaffe and Lenny Brenner and Bob Clark and everyone I could possibly cram into this scene. I would use real Mad guys.
Hmm.
So when I delivered this job, and remember, they weren't expecting this. John and Nick were expecting me to draw a lot of, I guess, faceless people or, generic people with
Hmm.
Dave Berg at the bar. And they looked at it and they saw all these Mad guys. They started cracking up. They said, "Oh, we got to show this to Bill." They went into Bill's office and I heard it. I heard the reason everybody wanted to please Bill. This enormous roar of a laugh.
Yep.
And they came back out And one of the things that everyone loved about Bill Gaines was that he paid on the spot. You didn't have to wait 3 weeks, a month, three
Mhm.
months for your check. You delivered a job. He had one of those old fashioned check writing machines, pushing, pushing. And I was sitting in John Ficarra's office. I heard pushing, 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 and they came back not with one check but two. And in addition to my regular payment for the job, there was an extra check, I don't know, $100, something like that. And they said, Bill thought it was so funny that he wanted you to have a bonus.
Wow.
So those are the kind of things you never saw at your other clients. I didn't get bonuses from my advertising clients or my magazine clients. I I didn't get invited on trips to Switzerland. I didn't get invited to Christmas parties. So that's really what made Mad different than everyone else. If they really wanted you to be part of the usual gang of idiots, they wanted you
Yep.
to be part of the family.
Wow. So flash forward a little bit. So you've been an artist, and then there came a day, unlike any other, uh, when the art director assignment opened up. Talk about that period when you sort of became, okay, I'm not just a freelance artist turning in jobs, but suddenly you're on staff. How did that happen?
Okay. Well, um, as I mentioned, Bill Gaines died in 1992. Um, he didn't really leave a plan of succession. It wasn't like he said, okay, I want so and so to step into my role as publisher. Bill had sold Mad in the early 60s for tax reasons. And eventually, Mad became part of what, at Bill's death, was the gigantic Time Warner empire. And Bill was the vice president of that, high muckety muck. But he had contractually insisted on being able to run Mad as he saw fit, like a comic book company in the 50s, which is how he
Mhm.
started out. And legendarily, he had it written into his contract that he had the right to be unreasonable. And uh, so he died, and really, I don't think anybody knew what to do. So the people at DC Comics kind of stepped in and said, look, Mad started as a comic book. Bill Gaines' dad created the comic book in the 1930s. Bill always had friendly relationships with everybody here at DC.
Mhm.
We think that Mad should continue publication under the umbrella of DC Comics, and I think no one else at Warner Brothers really had any other ideas that would compete with that. So
Mhm.
by 1993, Mad was part of DC Comics. It still was separate. Officially, it was still published by EC Publications, but our bosses now were Paul Levitz and Jeanette Kahn at DC Comics. And
Right.
I think at first they thought, we need to spiff up Mad. We need to reboot it. We need it to be a little edgier, a little more relevant, which I think was fairly difficult for people like Nick Meglin and John Ficarra, because you say, okay, I think you need uh, to do things differently, and they said, well, what we've been doing has been very successful,
Right.
and how how we think what we do is very funny, and now you're making us second guess what we're doing. And that's very difficult when you're doing humor, to say, is this really funny? Do they think it's funny? Because humor you need to do for yourself. You need to think, I think this is funny.
Right.
And so it was a little difficult, I think. Now, I was not on staff at the time. I was just a freelancer, but I got a sense that things were a little dicey. They were trying to figure out how to relaunch the magazine. They changed the logo a little bit.
Mhm.
They put a border on it for a while. The one concrete thing that happened was that um, I think the powers that be decided that since the digital age was dawning, that Lenny Brenner, who had taken over as art director when John Putnam died in 1980, uh, he was a little too old fashioned. He was really, really expert at what he did, but what he did was really, let's call it analog. Um, so he was kind of bumped to a consultant position, and they brought in a younger person named Jonathan Schneider, the art director. Uh, about that didn't work out. Uh, Jonathan was gone with after about 3 years, and I believe that John and Nick wanted to put Nadina Simon, who Jonathan had brought in as an associate art director,
Mhm.
into the AD chair, but the people upstairs wanted a name. And I know that they interviewed a lot of people and they were not happy with what they were seeing. And I happened to be sitting with Fakara after delivering a job one day. This would have been late in 1998.
Mhm.
And I don't know. I think that I was talking about the fact that they had offered me a bullpen job a few years before that I turned down because I really didn't want to interfere with my freelance career at the time. And I think I said something to Jonathan. If you'd offered me that job now, I would have had to think of it differently because now I've got a 4-year old at home. And uh, and what I also didn't say to John was that I was going through a little bit of a midlife crisis. I think I'd been doing what I'd been doing for well over 20 years,
Mhm.
and I was looking for, I don't know, something new, a new challenge, a new way of doing things. And when I said all this to him, I didn't see the light bulb go up over his head because I was not looking for that art director job. It didn't
Right.
even cross my mind. To me, art directors were designers, not illustrators, not cartoonists. And I really didn't know anything about the job. But the next morning, Fakara called me up. He said, "How'd you like to be our art director?" I said, "Are you kidding me?" I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Very much so. I talked to over Nick, and we would like you to be our art director." I said, "Do you think I'd be more valuable to you as an art director than as an illustrator?" He said, "Absolutely." So I that he was looking for a way to stop me drawing for Mad. But I said, "Okay, let me think about it." I came home, I talked to my wife, and she said, "I don't think you should do it." I said,
Really?
"Why not?" She said, "Look, I just want you to be happy. All you've ever wanted to do was draw, and you've been doing for all these years. I don't know that you're going to be happy working in an office, having to do a 9 to 5 job, having to answer to bosses, having to be someone else's boss." And I said, "Okay, well, you've got some good arguments there, but I don't know. It's intriguing. I was looking for a new challenge, and boy, this would certainly be it." I said, "Okay, look, why don't I give it a year? If I'm not happy, I'll go back to freelancing." And so I called John up and said, "Okay, I'll do it." And I said, probably even told him, I said, "Look, I'll give it a year. If I'm not happy, I want to go back to illustration." And I said, "Okay." Now, looking at it from this point of view, I a year passed, and then another year, and then another year, and then 19 years later, they had to take me out kicking and screaming. So
It worked
I
out.
guess it worked out. But
I think it was all the free comic books that you got every week.
I was over comic books by this time. It was very interesting working for DC Comics because at one point in my life, that was my goal. I wanted to be a DC Comics artist. When I was 15, I made my first trip to New York from Detroit. My only desire was to meet Carmine Infantino, who was editorial director at the time, and show him my stuff. So that really was kind of ironic that so many years later, literally 30 years later, here I was working for DC Comics, but no longer really wanting to be a comic book artist. But it was not a totally smooth transition. As John said, I was like a deer in the headlights those first months because I really didn't know what I was doing. Fortunately, there were people there who had been there for some time, like Nadina Simon, like Tom Noskowski, Marla Weich, who helped me. They helped me know what I was supposed to be doing, and I also realized that while I had maybe certain skills that would be useful to me as an art director, that there are a lot of things that other people would and could do better than I could, which, mostly had to do with design. So uh, at some point, I actually said to John, we need to start hiring more people because we were bringing out a lot of titles, not just mad specials. And my ruling thought whenever I hired someone was this person has to be better than I am. And more
Kind of
than,
a low bar there, Sam.
well, in some ways, yeah,
No, I'm kidding.
absolutely. I mean, you're joking, but,
Well,
uh,
you're primarily an illustrator,
right.
but some of the skills involved in, and especially regarding the computer, which I know you gained tremendous skill in working in computer, but your first love, obviously, penciling, painting, drawing, inking, all of those things. But frequently you needed other skills to be able to work on other people's work.
Yeah, no question. The technical skills, computer skills would come, and because basically we were all learning at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
When I started, a lot of stuff was still being done the old-fashioned way. Lenny Brenner was still coming into the office and setting up mechanicals and doing boards for Mort Drucker and Angelo Torres and Al Jaffe's fold-ins. Um, and a lot of this digital stuff was being based on its analog precedents, so
Mm-hmm.
that since I kind of knew some of that stuff already, I was able to learn the digital stuff as it came up, uh, and so were the people that I was working with. It was more, I think, the sense of while I knew how to compose an illustration,
Mm-hmm.
excuse me, I never felt as comfortable with more abstract sorts of design and type design. So, as I said, this was my guiding spirit whenever I hired someone. Are they a better designer than I'll ever be? And I think that the people I did hire over the years, Ryan Flanders and Patty Dwyer and
Mm-hmm.
Doug Thompson, were all superior designers. They were excellent designers. And this allowed me to give them the work that demanded a higher sense of design, and I would keep for myself things like the movie parodies and television spoofs, which were kind of already set up. We didn't change much from the way Lenny had been doing it since the Putnam years. Um, we just kind of ported it over into the digital era. Um, and to be honest, that design was really much more rudimentary. And as I said, it was already set more or less in stone. It was really engineering more than design. So, what I did bring to the table, I think, was that as a working illustrator and working cartoonist, I had learned how to be a problem solver. And I think that's what really attracted John and Nick to have me in that job. But it also meant that when I was working with artists, I could work with them on their own terms. I think every illustrator has war stories about getting an assignment from an editor, and the editor has this vision. I think I'm going to steal something from Nick Meglin. Okay, what I want you to do is, you remember that scene from Gone with the Wind where Scarlett O'Hara is going through the railroad station, and there are like acres and acres of bodies. There are wounded soldiers, there are dead soldiers as far as the eye can see. And as we're looking at this picture, we realize that in the distance, one of the soldiers is sitting up, and we can see his belt buckle. And the belt buckle has the name of his beloved engraved on it. And it becomes a poignant story. And as an illustrator, you say, wait, you want this vast panoramic scene, and in the distance, you want us to be able to see someone's belt buckle? Can't be done. And I knew that as an as a former art illustrator, if I gave an artist an assignment and he said, you can't do that, can't be done, I could show them how it could be done.
Right.
And I think that most of the artists I worked with respected me on that level, and they knew that in a certain way I had their backs, because they wouldn't be responsible for coming up with an answer to an unanswerable assignment. That before I even gave it to them, I had figured out how it could be done, and in many cases had actually done little doodles to show them what we were looking for.
Right.
Um, and I always was a little hesitant about doing these
Yeah.
doodles because, you don't want to hinder an artist. But the thing that fascinated me was it was the older artists, the more experienced artists, people like Al Jaffe and Paul Coker, who asked me to do doodles, and it became clear eventually why. They didn't want to have to be flailing about asking themselves what are they looking for. I would be able to show them what we were looking for, and that gave them the freedom that if they felt they could do it better, because I always told them, if you can do this better, please show me.
Hmm.
That if they could do it better, that they could. And in the case of someone like Al Jaffe, I'd give him a little doodle for a gag, because it might be one of these mad, you're a something or other when, and it'd be 8 gags on a 2-page spread, and I'd do these little doodles. And Al would do what I had asked him for in the doodle, but then somehow he'd cram 3 or 4 more gags into the same little panel.
Right.
In the case of Paul Coker, he might decide that the whole thing would be better if it was totally redesigned, and he would send me back a totally rethought out spread. And there might have been occasions where I said, Paul, I think we got to stick with what we gave you. But I can remember definitely occasions where I said, Paul, you just saved this article, you just made it 20 times better.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and so as I said, I think that they respected the fact that I knew what I was doing on that level, and they knew that they could do what they did best without being told, no, 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 back to the drawing board, back to the drawing board.
Right.
So over the years, we worked up a great system, where I had a staff of terrific designers who knew what they were doing. I could work on the stuff I did best.
Hmm.
And I think we also eventually evolved into a system where, unlike some magazines that have kind of assembly lines where um, you have a creative director, a head designer, an art director, a production person. I said, look, here's an article. You design it, you assign the art, you
Hmm.
do the final production. This
Right.
article you own, soup to nuts. And I think that the people in the Mad Art department liked doing it this way because there was more variety to it in the long run. They had more responsibility and then could
Hmm.
take much more personal pride in the outcome. Uh,
Right.
in the early days, they would do all the design and production, and I'd work with the artist. But eventually, I'd be able to say, "Okay, you know what? You know Al Jaffe. Call him up. Ask him if he wants to illustrate this, and
Yeah.
work with them on it. You don't need me." And you know, I think that allowed everybody to grow, including myself.
Hmm.
Uh, so everyone got a chance to work at every step of the process and to be proud of what they did.
That's really amazing. Sam Viviano, longtime mad artist and illustrator and art director and illustrator for other people and other things and other stuff. Where can we follow you, Sam?
I'm occasionally posting stuff on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn. If you do a search for Sam Viviano or Sam Viviano Illustrator, you should be able to find me.
Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
It's been absolutely my pleasure, David.
Thank you. If you like this, please like and subscribe.